Hi everyone, in a previous video I showed you how I turned a stitch file that I purchased off the internet into a ScanNCut applique cut file, and I showed you how I did that process, and I showed you how I cut the elements out with the ScanNCut. In today's video I'm going to be using those applique pieces to make another project. So I've got my machine set up for embroidery, and I've got my hoop pin, and I've got a piece of white cotton fabric. So I'm just going to work my way through the applique process, stitching out the placement lines and then applying the elements of this applique. And then once this is done, I'm then going to turn this into a wall hanging. So I've got the design set up, I'm all ready to go, and it's just a case now of stitching out the first placement line. So you can see here now the placement lines for the first set of fabric. So I just need to bring in the little felt boots that I cut the other day, position those over those stitches, and then I'm going to use a piece of silicone paper and just press those down just to hold them in place, because they have got heat and bond on the back. Then I'm going to put it back in the machine and carry on stitching out the design. So this is just doing the tack down stitch, and this is a zigzag design. So once it's done this on both feet, it will then do the zigzag top stitching. Okay, it's done the placement line for the next piece of applique, so I'm going to take this out of the machine, iron the piece of applique on, and change my thread for the top stitching. Just going to cut away all these red threads. And the next piece to go down now is the beard section. Now I did end up cutting the beard again in a different colour than I showed in the previous video. It was the same fabric, I've just switched up the colour. So I just want to make sure that this is positioned over that stitch line. I'm going to bring my silicone sheet in again and just give it a quick press with the iron, just to activate the heat and bond on the back of the fabric, and that will just hold it securely in place, ready for the next set of stitching. Okay, so this isn't difficult to do. It's just one of those things that you just need to take your time with and just work through it methodically, step by step, and you will be fine. So I've got that in place now. I'm just going to do the tack down stitch, and then it's going to do the zigzag stitch, and then it's going to move on to the next part of the design. I'm just going to stop the machine and cut the threads so they're out of the way. And the beauty of having your ScanNCut cut your applique for you is that you don't have to take this out and keep cutting around the fabric. In Embrilliance Essentials, it inflates the basting stitch by 1.5 millimeters, which means it's going to cut your fabric that much bigger. And then when you just position it, it will be held in place. Okay, so it's now ready to move on to the next element. So I'm going to leave the white thread in because this is just the placement line, so you're not going to see it anyway. And then once it's stitched this placement line out, I'll position my piece of fabric and I'll change my thread to match. So I'm just going to bring the hat piece in and position that over the stitches. And you do want to be careful how you're doing this. You know, you want to make sure that you get right in over the design. You want the fabric covering that stitch line all the way around so that you'll know then that when it comes to do the tack down stitch in the next part, it will be picking up the fabric for you. Again, I'm just going to bring in a piece of silicone paper and I'm just going to hit that with the iron just to help it fuse down. If you have one of those little Clover, small, tiny, like triangular type little irons, you could probably do this while it was still in the machine, but I'm obviously just keep taking mine out so it's ready for a colour change on my thread and then it's going to stitch that down. Okay, so I think the nose is the next section. So I'm going to take this out, change the thread and carry on. Okay, so this next element is the placement line for the heart. So I've just used the same thread that I did for the nose, but I'm going to have to change it now to red because I'm going to be using a piece of red heat transfer glitter vinyl for this next section. Okay, so I'm going to position the heat transfer vinyl, which I've already removed the clear sheet off, and I'm just going to position it over that placement line. Then I'm going to bring in the silicone paper again and position this on top and just quickly iron it in place to help it just fuse to the fabric, just to hold it in place in readiness for the next set of stitching. It's going to do the tack down stitch, then it's going to do the zigzag stitch, and then it's just a case of doing the last two elements, which are all just embroidery, no applique, and that's the hands and the little heart on the end of the hat, and then this design will be finished. Okay, that's all done, so I'm just going to remove this from the hoop. Now, I'm not sure whether I said at the beginning or not, but because this piece of fabric didn't fit completely in my hoop, this stabiliser is a tear-away fusible, so I've fused it onto the back temporarily. So the first thing I'm going to do is cover the design with my piece of silicone paper, and I'm just going to give it a good iron to make sure that all the heat and bond on the back of those fabrics is all fused to the piece of white cotton. I know I've stitched them down, but I'm just going to give it a quick press. So I can get rid of all this stabiliser now, and this piece of applique is then ready for me to use in the next part of this project. So there's just a little close-up, and I think that came out adorable. So this is now ready for me to carry on. I'll just rehoop some stabiliser, and then I'll be back to do the next part of the project. Okay, so for the next part of the design, this is a wall hanging that I purchased from Designs by Juju, and within the file there are various stitch files for all different models of machine, and then within each file there are two embroidery designs that you can stitch out, and there's one called a blank, but the blank has quilting diagonal stitches in it, and I didn't want that in my design because I want to use the applique that I've just made. So I opened the stitch file in Embrilliance Essentials and I deleted out the step where it would do the quilting lines. So now I've called up the design onto my sewing machine, I've hooped a piece of stabiliser, which is what it tells me to do, and I'm now going to stitch step 1, which is the placement line for putting down the batting. Okay, so that's done that. So the next bit it tells you is to put down your batting over the stitched line. So I'm just going to position this in place, making sure that it covers all those stitch lines I've just done. It tells you now the next step is to put your front piece of fabric over the stitch line. So this is where my applique piece is going to go. So I just want to make sure that it's all in place. So to help with placement, I've just put a crease in the centre at the top and bottom of this piece of fabric, and I want to try and bring the gnome down as close to the bottom as possible, but still have it centred within the hoop, because this design has another piece going along the top, and I've reduced this stitch file down quite considerably, and it literally, I think, will only just fit. Okay, so it tells you to remove the hoop from the machine and to cut away this top section here, because this is going to have a different colour in it. Okay, so I'm just going to bring this in a little bit closer, and I've got my small scissors. So you don't remove this from the hoop at all, you just work on it in the hoop. It tells you to cut away the top section. So I'm just going to snip with these scissors, and I'm just going to follow this stitch line all the way around and go straight across there. And you want to get as close as possible without going into the stitching and not cutting the batting. And if you use curved embroidery stitches here, you should be okay. So now it needs to go back into the machine, and it's going to stitch the placement line for the next piece of fabric. Okay, so now you have to remove this from the machine, and you have to trim away this bottom section here now. Leave all the top of this blue fabric in place, just trim around the bottom scallop section. Again, I'm just going to come in with my scissors and come along here and trim this and leave everything else. And then this goes back into the machine. And I think it's at this point in the design where it would normally do the quilting and then go on to the satin stitch, but I've took the quilting out, so I think it's just going to do the satin stitch. Okay, so as I've not stitched this design before, there's a step that it needs to do that I hadn't realised. I thought it needed to go on to the next stage. So basically what I've done, I've pulled it out of the machine because it started stitching, and then on my machine here I've just hit this minus button to move the needle back to the start of where I'd just gone wrong. It had started stitching to about here, and then I realised that I shouldn't have got my other fabrics down. So I've just kept hitting this minus button to bring the needle back. I've unpicked the stitches and now I'm going to carry on. So I think I need to do one more row of stitching, then I need to go back and just put the tabs in and the back pieces, and then I think it should be finished. Okay, so I'm hoping now that this is where I need to put the tabs back in and put the backing section on. So I'm going to lift up the presser foot, I'm going to put the tabs in like this in the folded edge, so it's along this bottom section where the kind of satin stitch is, and then I'm going to try and get the other one in the same kind of position and about the similar distance from the end. And I'm going to bring in the fabric for the back again, folded edge into the middle, my pieces of tape back down, and hope now that this is the right section of the design. Okay, and this is why I wanted the tape down, because the foot has gone underneath that piece of fabric. Okay, so what I've done, I've put extra tape across the joins in the hope that as this foot comes along now, it won't get caught up in that piece of fabric. So I've backed the stitch up again to where it started, and this should be the last section. Then it's a case of trimming away the excess and turning it right side out, and it should hopefully be finished. So one thing I would say, if you make this, when you lay this last top section over the top, tape it down and also tape it across the middle, because as you can see, as my machine has just gone back to its centre, the foot's gone under here again. Now it doesn't matter because I'm not doing any more sewing, it's finished, but it's just a point that you might need to, you know, take note of. So I'm going to release this from the machine. I'm going to move all this tape. It doesn't matter that it's been sewn through because this is all on the inside, and it'll probably pull away from the stitches anyway because the needle will have pierced it. It's coming away fine, so just take your time with it, peel it away. This will be far easier when you do it yourself. It's because I've got a camera aimed at me and I'm trying to manoeuvre around it. So that's all done now, so it just needs taking out of the hoop, and it tells you to trim about 1/4 of an inch all the way round. And then if you want to round off the corners to take away some of that bulk, and then you can trim your corners. Don't get too close to your stitching line, and then we should be able to flip this inside out, and then it'll probably just need a good press. So as you can see, the applique design I did position it quite close to the bottom. I could have gone up a few more steps, but I did know that when I was in Embrilliance and I was shrinking this down, I knew it was always going to be a close fit because the actual applique design is a lot bigger than this wall hanging I wanted to put it on. So I'm just going to give it a quick press now. There it is, all finished, and I think for a first attempt it's not turned out too bad. So it's got the hanging clips, you just put a piece of dowel or a hanger or something going through here now. The whole idea of this is you can get one of those plastic stands that stands on your desk, you know, like a backward facing L, and you can slide that in the back and it can sit if you don't want the hanging hoops in it. But I'm going to put some dowel through mine and hang it on the wall, I think. So I'll take a close-up picture, and that's today's project. So I hope you liked it. Please give the video a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.